All right, cool. All right, so I'm William Wylie-Modro, and this is the Regenerative Grazing team. So we're going to break it into two parts. The first part is regenerative grazing a big CDR opportunity? Trying to answer that question. So we should probably ask, what is regenerative grazing? So generally, conventional grazing is you have a piece of land and you essentially put your cows out on it, and then they go, graze where they want, and generally it can lead to overgrazing. So regenerative grazing, and it's got many other names, is essentially breaking your fields up into specific paddocks and then taking your entire cattle herd and then iterating through those different paddocks such that there is time left for the paddocks to regrow and therefore pump nutrients and carbon into the ground. Right? So one of the reasons why this could be thought of as a huge CDR opportunity is that there's a lot of land. So there's 8.2 billion acres of pasture land on the earth. That is more than twice the amount of land that we use for crops. And that's also because it's native grasslands. It's kind of like its natural state. And an important thing to note here is the US does have a decent amount of that land. It has about 7% at 0.6 billion. But there are countries with larger, and some of the countries here you might not expect to have larger pasture land than others. And it also shows how much of an international sort of movement this would have to be in order to scale it. So now that we know that there's a bunch of land, how much carbon can we sequester, right? And if you know anything about soil carbon, you know that this is a really difficult question to answer. So the main lever in it is how degraded that land is when you begin the regeneration. And then also other factors of the soil type and the climate and a million other things. But one important thing to note is that the carbon sequestration rate does decrease as it hits a saturation point. So soil carbon does have a natural saturation point, at least it seems so. So you get a graph vaguely like this, where you can have a lot of carbon sequestration at the beginning, and then it levels off to an equilibrium. And this is a bit of a slow graph. Normally it's not like 50 years, more it's like 20 years or so, where you start to hit like very small sequestration rates. So with that in mind, if you take a piece of land that is extremely degraded and is in the kind of like an ideal land management, an ideal climate, and then you start grazing on it, you can actually get very, very high sequestration rates. But again, those will only be in the first like 3 to 20 years. You can even see here, the first one is almost 12 tons per acre. That's over 3 years, and then it gradually goes down. The bottom one here is 20 years. So that's important to note, because if you just multiplied, 12 times 8 billion, that's a lot. So taking this in mind, how much is the actual global average rate? Noting that a lot of the land is not degraded and it's in different climate zones and all that jazz. So looking at two different studies, it looks like it's more like a quarter to a half ton per acre per year for grassland. And then silver pasture, which essentially has more trees and such things, has a higher sequestration rate because there's, guess what, more biomass to sequester carbon into. So this shows that it could be a gigaton opportunity over the entire globe. And it's also important to note that there's additional benefits, including restoring degraded land and in general just improving climate resiliency. There's a fly in the ointment, though. This methane thing is kind of annoying. Essentially, if you have about half to 1 cow unit per acre, your emissions are somewhere around 0.1 to 8 tons per acre per year. So that's a lot higher than our average sequestration rate. So we just heard from the methane people, who were wonderful. There is ways to reduce methane if you add certain types of seaweed into feedlots. And the study we looked at was it could reduce methane emissions by 80%. So if you do this, and if you assume a carbon sequestration rate of about half a ton per acre per year, you still, there might be a little bit of total drawdown, but mostly it's just going to be a reduction. So this led us to determine that it's not a huge CDR opportunity in the typical sense that we think, but it's a large reduction opportunity, and it's a very large climate resiliency and land regeneration opportunity. It's also important to note that as much as maybe we shouldn't eat beef, the beef production is expected to increase 9% in the next decade, mainly from China, Pakistan, Latin America, and milk production is also expected to increase. So gonna have to deal with this problem either way. So that's why we think probably scaling regenerative grazing is a good idea. We can do it in a very particular ways. A constraint is that generally if you have grass finished beef versus grain finished beef, it takes 2.5 times more land to have the grass finished beef. So that could cause problems in itself, but it's not a binary solution. You could have methods where you regeneratively graze the cows for several months and then send them to a feedlot, which is becoming more and more common, and that could be a potential way to get around this. So with all that context in mind, let's ask about how we can scale it. And I'm going to leave it to Kurt here.
So yeah, the next part we looked at were what are some of the barriers that farmers face when looking to transition to regenerative grazing methods, and what are some of the solutions or opportunities that we identified. And these are the buckets that we examined it through. So the first one, social pressures, is something that is often the biggest barrier to overcome. There is a lot, particularly with family-owned farms, there are practices that have been passed down through generations, and there is just the way that things have always been done. And secondly, there is often with regenerative grazing, often you're letting your fields grow, and they sometimes can be perceived as being overgrown. They might have weeds in them, and there's often pressure from your neighbors around, like, oh, you don't look like you're being a good farmer because your fields aren't being well managed. And so some of the things we identified are key about education, and particularly around the next generation of farmers, as for family-owned farms, as they're getting passed down through to the younger generations. There's an opportunity there. Organizations like Soil Health Academy and Savory Network are doing great work, and also some of these communities that are emerging online to give farmers a network that's not just in their immediate rural area, such as Kiss the Ground and others are doing great work there to bring farmers together and for them to share operational and other learnings.
Hi, Sean. We're going to talk quickly about the finance piece of transitioning to a regenerative grazing operation. Farming in general is an industry with unstable cash flows, and also it's a very low margin business. Capital expenditures are something we always have to be cognizant of. There's also a labor component of this. If you're going to regenerative grazing, you're going to need more ranch hands. And also, like any business transformation, you're always going to have a short-term productivity hit. But there are solutions. So the first one, we'd say the federal government has the Farm Loan Program, which is a big one. Also, there are organizations like MADAG and Regen Network out there that help with the finance piece and offer consulting. Also, there are, of course, a lot of not-for-profits out there that's mission is dedicated to helping farmers and ranchers through this transition. Also, there's, we talked about the productivity lag. There is the profit opportunity with things like organic and grass-fed beef. We know there's a price premium that farmers can get. There's the technological innovation. So we get operational efficiencies from some of this new technology. And lastly, there's an opportunity for ancillary revenue through things like incorporating renewables onto the pasture. I'm going to turn it over to Wendy now.
Awesome, thanks, John. And so we also have structural challenges, of course, like agricultural subsidies right now are for corn and soy. And if we could transfer those into things like grass-fed beef, that'd be awesome, which we could do through policy and advocacy. So we've got lots of opportunity there. Of course, access to processing and distribution is huge, but there's also incredible opportunity as well for partnerships, co-ops, nonprofits, wholesale, like Whole Foods, CSAs, all those awesome things can be a part of that network. Obtaining and maintaining certifications is an upfront cost challenge and also continuous, but things like service markets, like carbon offsets, like Nori's doing, might be a really great potential to help fund those needs for production. And also, of course, we want to think about the cow, its animal wellness, and the solutions like Seaweed, like we mentioned, everyone, it's such a great opportunity. It's super nutritious for the cow. It decreases feed needs by 14%. So to sum things up, GHG reduction and climate resiliency potential is big. We must offset that methane, as Will mentioned, and also time is going to be a huge factor, not just the regenerative time, but also we got to get this thing going. So profitability is also real. Market support, partnerships, carbon markets, awesome. And then ultimately we're creating a holistic ecosystem. We can restore that degraded land while improving biodiversity and having happy cows. Again, that opportunity for government alliance with subsidies, advocacy, legislation. And then of course, as we all want, more regenerative farmers. We can get that productivity going, awesome integration, and truly create circular economy that involves regenerative grazing. And that's a wrap, guys. So everyone go be a regenerative farmer.